Hey everyone, and welcome back. Ready to dig into something really interesting. Today we're really going deep on Gene Sharp's From Dictatorship to Democracy.
Yeah, this one's a classic.
It really is. And if you've ever wondered how change really happens, how people can challenge even like the most powerful, the most entrenched systems and structures, well, this deep dive is for you.
I mean, Sharp's work, it's basically a handbook, right? It's like a how-to manual for nonviolent struggle.
Totally.
And he doesn't just talk about, the ideals, which are important, but he actually lays out this framework.
Yeah, strategic framework.
Yeah, for understanding, like, where a dictator's power comes from and, crucially, how to dismantle it.
We're not just theorizing here either.
Yeah.
Sharp, he looks at all these real-world examples.
Right.
From historical uprisings to even the fall of communism in Europe,
Right.
to show how these principles have actually played out.
Yeah, it's fascinating how he challenges some of those traditional assumptions about revolutions.
Oh, totally.
Like this idea that dictatorships are toppled just by force, by violence.
Right.
He says, no, in fact, it often backfires.
Yeah, that seems counterintuitive.
Yeah.
If a dictator is using violence to stay in power, wouldn't fighting back with violence be the most, logical response?
Yeah, it's definitely a natural instinct, right?
Sure.
But Sharp points out that, well, dictators usually have the upper hand when it comes to violence.
Right. They control the military, the weapons, all of that.
They've got the guns.
Yeah.
So a violent uprising basically just gives them an excuse to justify being even harsher.
Right. Yeah.
Which just leads to more suffering for the very people it's trying to help.
So if violence isn't the answer, then what is?
Right. So Sharp says that a dictator's real power, it actually comes from the cooperation and the obedience of the population.
It's like that saying, you're never truly powerless if you have the power to say no.
Exactly. He has this great analogy, the monkey master fable.
Okay.
So picture this, okay? There's an old man, and he controls a bunch of monkeys. And he does this by making them gather fruit for him, right? The monkeys, they obey him out of fear.
Right.
Out of habit, even though they're the ones suffering.
Right. They're doing all the work.
But then one day, one little monkey, he's like, wait a minute.
He's like, this isn't right.
Why are we doing this? Why are we serving this old man when we could just gather the fruit for ourselves?
Yeah.
And this sparks, this realization among all the monkeys. They all realize he's right.
Yeah. We have the power.
They decide to stop obeying. They take their power back.
Yeah.
They grab the fruit, they run off, and the old man, he's left totally powerless.
I like that. So it's like the monkeys, they're like the people living under a dictatorship.
Exactly.
They're essentially giving the dictator the power.
Precisely. And once they see that, they can choose to take it back.
So how do they do that?
So Sharp calls this political defiance.
Okay.
It's not about fighting fire with fire. It's more like strategically dismantling the things that keep the dictatorship going.
So what are those things? What are those levers of power that Sharp's talking about?
Right. He talks about authority. So that's
Yeah.
the dictator's perceived right to rule, which they build on all sorts of things.
Okay.
Like tradition or charisma or even a certain ideology.
So it's not just about the dictator themselves. It's about this whole network.
Right.
The people and the institutions that prop them up.
Exactly. Then you've got the human resources. So these are all the people who work for the regime, the ones who enforce the rules and keep that system running.
So that's the whole bureaucracy of it all.
Right. And then there are the skills and knowledge.
Oh, right. Of the people within the system.
Yeah. So like the engineers, doctors, anybody with specialized skills, economists, even propagandists.
Yeah, the people who keep things functioning.
Right. And of course, the material resources.
So the wealth of the country.
Yeah. The infrastructure.
Yeah.
Communication networks, everything the regime controls.
And then, of course, there's always the threat of sanctions.
Right.
That fear is powerful.
It's a big one.
Yeah.
But Sharp says all of these sources of power, it all boils down to one thing.
Okay.
The people's willingness to go along with it.
So you're saying even the most brutal dictatorship, it's vulnerable if enough people decide, nope, we're done, and they withdraw their support.
That's the idea. Sharp actually says dictatorships, despite how strong they might seem, they're inherently fragile. He compares them to Achilles.
Oh, Achilles and his heel.
Yeah. They seem invincible, but there's always a weak spot.
So where are the chinks in the dictator's armor then? What makes them vulnerable?
Well, Sharp lays out 17 weaknesses that are kind of baked into dictatorships.
17.
Yeah, there are a lot.
Okay.
And they range from, like you said, this reliance on cooperation from the people to just internal inefficiencies. They're often really bad at adapting to change.
Right, they get stuck in their ways.
Totally.
Yeah.
And then there's the potential for dissent, even within their own ranks. People start to question things.
That makes me think about a lot of the regimes we've seen crumble throughout history, right?
Yeah.
It's usually not this single decisive blow that takes them down.
Right. It's a process.
Yeah, it's this gradual erosion of power.
It's like all these little cracks that appear and eventually shatter the whole facade.
Yeah, where do those cracks often appear first?
Well, often in the intellectual communities.
Okay.
The students, they're the ones asking questions, challenging the status quo, kind of imagining a different way.
So we've talked about these cracks in the armor, but how do you actually use them? Right?
Right.
How do you go from just seeing the problem to actually sparking a movement that can make a difference?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Sharp says that a successful struggle for freedom, it takes courage, of course,
Right.
but it also takes a lot of strategic thinking.
You can't just rush in.
No, you
Ah.
got to have a plan. It's not reckless rebellion. It's calculated resistance.
Right, because if you run into a fight, you're going to lose. That helps no one.
Exactly.
So he emphasizes planning,
Yes.
but also discipline.
Oh, absolutely.
Nonviolent struggle requires an incredible amount of discipline.
Yeah, I bet. Especially when you're facing violence.
Especially when you're facing violence.
Yeah.
It's easy to get angry and want to fight back,
Yeah.
you know?
Totally human nature.
Right. But Sharp says, look, that plays right into the dictator's hand.
Because then they can be like, see, I told you they were dangerous.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They can justify getting even harsher.
Right.
So it's almost like this.
It's like that whole political judo thing,
It's
right?
exactly. Using your opponent's strength against them.
Yeah.
By not meeting violence with violence, you show their true colors,
You stay on the moral high ground.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
And that is powerful.
But that's got to take so much strength
It really does.
to maintain that discipline.
It does. That's why Sharp talks about how important strong leadership is, clear communication.
Right.
Making sure everyone's on the same page about what they're fighting for.
So it's not just this chaotic, mob.
No. It
Right.
has to be organized.
It's like an army, but with a different kind of weapon. Exactly. And just like an army, you need to train people how to fight, how to respond without violence, even under pressure.
It makes me think of those iconic images,
Yeah.
like Tank Man in Tiananmen Square.
Right.
Or the Children's Crusade in Birmingham.
Powerful images.
Yeah, moments of just incredible courage in the face of just overwhelming force.
And they're so powerful because they show something so fundamental, right?
What's that?
You can't crush the human spirit with brute force. It just doesn't work.
So Sharp, he talks about this grand strategy
Right.
for liberation, but then also these campaign strategies.
Right.
What's the difference?
Okay, so think of the grand strategy as the overall vision, right?
Right.
It's the big picture.
Right.
The roadmap to getting to a free and democratic society.
Okay.
The campaign strategies are more like the specific routes you take to get there.
Okay.
The smaller actions, the campaigns that move you along that path.
So it's like you've got the blueprint for a house, but then you also need the detailed instructions.
Exactly. You got it. And just like building a house, planning is everything. You got to identify your objectives, what you're trying to achieve,
Right.
figure out the best way to resist in each situation,
Right.
and always have a backup plan. Because, as they say, no plan survives contact with the enemy.
Exactly. Things
life.
change. You got to be able to adapt.
Always be ready to adapt.
Yeah.
And one thing he talks about is selective resistance.
Okay. What does that mean?
Basically, you're choosing your battles carefully,
Okay.
especially at the beginning, when you're just starting out. You don't try to tackle everything at once.
You pick your spots.
You pick your spots. You focus on the things where you've got a real shot at winning.
So you can start racking up some wins.
Exactly. Build momentum. Show people that change is possible.
Okay.
He also talks about symbolic challenge,
What's that?
using really powerful symbols to make the regime look bad.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, imagine this. You've got a dictatorship where people aren't allowed to gather in public, right? But then a group of people, they go to the main square in silence.
Okay.
They lay down flowers, and then they just melt back into the crowd before the authorities can do anything.
Oh, like that.
It's small, but it's powerful.
Yeah.
You're not using violence, but you're sending a message.
It's about getting in their heads.
Exactly. It's about changing the story.
Yeah.
And as more and more people find the courage to say no,
Mm-hmm.
the regime starts to lose its grip.
It's like that saying, what if they gave a war and nobody came?
Exactly. Sharp talks about spreading responsibility, getting everyone involved in the fight.
So it's not just on like the students or the workers.
Yeah.
It's everyone's responsibility.
It's got to be everybody, because when a huge chunk of the population decides they're not playing along anymore, the system just stops working.
It can't function.
It falls apart.
Okay, so the movement's gaining steam, the cracks are getting wider.
Right.
But how do you actually topple the dictator? What the final push look like?
So Sharp talks about something called disintegrating the dictatorship.
Okay.
It's basically cutting off the sources of its power one by one.
How do you do that?
Well, it could be mass protests, strikes, refusing to cooperate with their institutions. And he also talks about creating parallel institutions.
What does that mean?
It's like building a new society inside the shell of the old one.
Oh, wow.
So you're setting up independent media outlets to fight the propaganda,
Okay.
organizing free and fair elections at the local level, maybe even creating alternative systems for providing basic services.
It's like you're building a life raft while the ship is going down.
Exactly. And as more people jump ship, the old regime loses power, loses legitimacy, and eventually it just collapses.
So you're basically creating a situation where the movement is more legitimate than the actual government.
Exactly. Sharp calls it dual sovereignty.
I like it.
It's a really interesting concept.
It is, but then what happens after the regime falls? How do you go from dictatorship to democracy without things just falling apart?
Right, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And
Yeah.
unfortunately, there's no easy answer. But Sharp says that a carefully managed transition is absolutely crucial. You don't want a power vacuum, because that just leads to chaos or even another dictatorship.
Right, you're trying to get rid of a dictator, not get a new one.
Exactly. He says, you've got to stop any attempts by the old guard to grab power.
So like the hardcore military guy.
Yeah, or the security services. He suggests mobilizing people to resist those attempts, establishing checks and balances in the new government, and maybe even reaching out for international support.
Okay, what about the old dictator? What happened to them?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
Sharp understands that people want justice, they want accountability, but he also warns against seeking revenge.
Tough outs.
It is. He suggests maybe truth and reconciliation commissions or offering amnesty in exchange for cooperation.
To try to keep the peace?
Exactly. But always remembering the principles of nonviolent struggle.
Right, you don't want to become the thing you're fighting against.
Exactly. And then, of course, you have to build a new system of government.
From the ground up.
Right. Sharp says it's crucial to have a constitution that lays out democratic principles, limits the power of the government, and protects individual rights. And he believes in getting everyone involved in that process.
So it's actually representative.
Exactly. The new system has to reflect the values and the hopes of the people.
So you've got this brand new government, this brand new constitution, but how do you actually protect it? Right. Like, what about defense? You were talking about Sharp's concept of democratic defense policy.
Right. That's all about creating a system that can actually protect itself, but without becoming, the thing it was trying to get away from.
Right. Yeah. Walking that tightrope between keeping people safe, but also keeping them free, which I imagine, especially for a new democracy, that's got to be a challenge.
Totally. And, Sharp talks about things like civilian-based defense, which basically means relying more on, the people themselves than on a traditional army.
Interesting. So it's more about empowering citizens to defend themselves, to defend their freedom.
Exactly. And it's all connected, right? It all comes back to those core principles we keep talking about. Nonviolence, strategic planning, people power. It's not just about getting rid of a dictator. It's about building a society that can resist tyranny in all its forms.
And that's what I find so fascinating about Sharp's work.
Yeah.
It's not just some abstract theory.
No, not at all.
It's got these really practical tools and ideas. And like you said, you can apply them to all kinds of situations.
Yeah.
Not just dictatorships.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. You could use this stuff in a workplace with a toxic boss.
Oh, yeah.
Or in a community that's dealing with, systemic injustice.
Right. Or even just in your own life.
Absolutely. Sharp's work, it reminds us that we're not powerless even when it feels like we are.
Exactly. And that's a powerful message. It gives us hope,
It really does. But it also reminds us that it's not easy. Building a better world, it takes work. It takes vigilance.
It's an ongoing process. We can't just rest on our laurels.
Exactly. And that's what I think is so important about this book, this deep dive that we've done. It's a call to action. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in shaping the future.
Absolutely. Well said. So much to think about. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us, everyone. Until next time.